I've never told this story in full before. Not to my wife, not to my therapist, not even to my own children when they've asked about why I refuse to drive down certain streets in my hometown. But I'm older now, and the sharp edges of memory have worn smooth enough that I think I can finally put it all down on paper. Maybe it will help someone else who's experienced something similar. Or maybe it will just help me sleep better at night. This happened in the summer of 1987, when I was 11 years old. My family had just moved to Millbrook, Connecticut, a sleepy New England town where the biggest excitement was usually the annual corn festival or when old Mrs. Henderson's cat went missing for a week. My father had gotten a job at the insurance company there, and my mother was thrilled to escape the cramped apartment we'd been sharing in Hartford. As for me, I was just hoping to make friends before school started in the fall. Our new house was a modest colonial on Elm Street, painted yellow with white shutters that my mother immediately declared charming. It had a small backyard that bordered a patch of woods, and from my bedroom window on the second floor, I could see clear across to the next street over Maple Street. That's where the Hendersons lived, along with the Kowalskis, the Chuns, and at the very end of the block, in a house that seemed to crouch in the shadows of two enormous oak trees, the Ashfords. I learned about the Ashfords from Tommy Kowalski, who became my first friend in Millbrook. Tommy was a year older than me, with a gap between his front teeth and an impressive collection of baseball cards. More importantly, he knew everything there was to know about our neighborhood, including which houses to avoid on Halloween and which backyards had the meanest dogs. "See that house way down there?" he said one afternoon as we sat on his front porch, dividing up a bag of penny candy. He pointed toward the end of Maple Street. "That's where the Ashfords live. They've got a kid our age, but he's weird. Weird." "How?" I asked, unwrapping a piece of chocolate. Tommy lowered his voice conspiratorially. "My mum says he's troubled. Last year, he set fire to the Hendersons' garden shed, and my sister Sarah says she saw him talking to invisible people in his backyard. Plus, his parents never come outside. Like ever. The only time anyone sees them is when they're loading groceries from their car into the house. And they do it super fast, like they're afraid someone's watching them." I studied the Ashford house from where we sat. It was hard to make out details from that distance, but it looked similar to all the other houses on the street stories. Probably built in the 1950s, with a small front yard and a driveway. The main difference was how the two oak trees seemed to loom over it, casting it in perpetual shadow even in the bright afternoon sun. "What's the kid's name?" I asked. Michael Ashford. He's going into 6th grade, same as me." Tommy bit into a piece of taffy. "You'll probably see him around, but trust me, don't try to be friends with him. There's something really off about that whole family." I should have listened to Tommy's warning, but I was 11, and I was curious, and I'd always been drawn to the mysterious and unexplained. 2 weeks later, I would encounter Michael Ashford for the first time, and my entire understanding of what was possible in this world would be turned upside down. It happened on a Tuesday morning. My mother had sent me to the corner store to pick up milk and bread, and I was taking the long way home, exploring the streets of my new neighborhood. Maple Street was particularly pretty, lined with mature trees and well-maintained houses, their lawns green and neatly trimmed. I was admiring the Chen's flower garden when I heard a voice behind me. "You're the new kid." I turned around to find a boy about my age standing about 10 feet away. He had sandy brown hair that looked like it hadn't seen a comb in weeks, pale skin that suggested he didn't spend much time outdoors, and the most unsettling green eyes I'd ever seen. They seemed to look right through me, as if he could see things that I couldn't. "Yeah," I said, shifting the grocery bag from one arm to the other. "I'm David Miller. We moved here from Hartford." "I know," he said. "I'm Michael." I didn't need to ask his last name. This was clearly the mysterious Ashford boy that Tommy had warned me about. Up close, he didn't seem particularly threatening, just quiet and intense, like he was thinking about something far more important than our conversation. "You live down there?" I asked, nodding toward the shadowy house at the end of the block. Michael glanced over his shoulder, then looked back at me. "Yeah, for now. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, as if he was listening to something I couldn't hear. After a moment, he said, "Do you want to see something cool?" Every instinct I had told me to say no, to make an excuse about getting home with the groceries, to follow Tommy's advice and steer clear of this strange boy. But curiosity won out, as it always did. "Okay," I said. Michael smiled for the first time since we'd started talking, but it wasn't a happy smile. It was the kind of smile that suggested he knew a secret that would change everything. "Come on," he said, and started walking toward his house. I followed him down Maple Street, past the other well-maintained homes, until we reached the Ashford property. Up close, I could see that the house was in decent repair, but there was something indefinably wrong about it. The windows seemed darker than they should have been, even accounting for the shade cast by the oak trees. The front yard, while not overgrown, had an unkempt quality that suggested neglect rather than design, and there was a smell in the air, unpleasant exactly, but strange, like old books and candle wax and something else I couldn't identify. "My parents aren't home," Michael said as we walked up the front path. "They went to the city for the day." "What's in the city?" I asked. "Doctors," he said simply, and something in his tone suggested I shouldn't ask any follow-up questions. The front door was painted dark green, with a small window at eye level covered by a lace curtain. Michael pulled out a key and unlocked it, pushing the door open and gesturing for me to follow him inside. The moment I stepped into the Ashford house, I knew something was different. It wasn't just the decor, though that was certainly unusual heavy furniture that looked like it belonged in a much older home. Thick curtains that blocked most of the natural light, walls covered with framed photographs that seemed to show the same few people over and over again, spanning decades. It was the atmosphere itself. The air felt heavier inside the house, almost thick, and there was a constant low humming sound that seemed to come from the walls themselves. "Cool house," I said, though I didn't really mean it. "It's been in my family for a long time," Michael said, closing the door behind us. "My great-grandfather built it in 1923. We've been here ever since." I looked around the living room, taking in the old furniture and the dozens of photographs. Many of them showed people in old-fashioned clothes, women in long dresses and men in formal suits, all posed stiffly for the camera. But what struck me was how similar they all looked. Same pale skin, same green eyes, same serious expressions. "Are these all your relatives?" I asked. "Yeah, going back generations." Michael walked over to the mantelpiece and picked up one of the frames. "This is my great-great-grandmother, Helena. She died in 1954, but she still lives here." I laughed, thinking he was making a joke. "What do you mean, she still lives here?" Michael looked at me with those unsettling green eyes, and I realized he wasn't joking at all. "I mean, she never left," he said. "None of them did. That's what I wanted to show you." Before I could ask what he meant, I heard footsteps on the floor above us. Slow, deliberate footsteps, like someone pacing back and forth in one of the upstairs bedrooms. "I thought you said your parents weren't home," I said, looking up at the ceiling. "They aren't," Michael said calmly. The footsteps continued for another minute, then stopped. In the silence that followed, I could hear my own heart beating. I wanted to leave, to make an excuse, and get out of that strange house as quickly as possible. But something kept me rooted to the spot. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was something else, a compulsion that seemed to come from outside myself. "Who's upstairs?" I asked, though part of me already knew I wouldn't like the answer. "Probably Grat-Uncle Robert," Michael said. "He died in 1978, but he likes to walk around up there. He's harmless though, not like some of the others." I stared at him. "You're saying there are dead people living in your house?" "Not living, exactly. But yeah, they're here." Michael set the photograph back on the mantelpiece. "My family doesn't really die, David. We just ... change." As if to prove his point, one of the photographs on the wall suddenly fell to the floor, the glass shattering. Neither Michael nor I had been anywhere near it. "Grat Aunt Margaret doesn't like strangers," Michael said apologetically, kneeling down to pick up the pieces of glass. "She'll get used to you." I should have run then. Every rational part of my brain was screaming at me to get out of that house and never come back. But 11-year-olds aren't always rational, and there was something almost hypnotic about the whole situation. It was like being in a dream where everything was strange and impossible, but somehow made perfect sense within the context of the dream itself. "How many of them are there?" I heard myself asking. Michael considered the question seriously. "Hard to say exactly. Some of them only show up occasionally, but there are at least 15 or 20 that are here most of the time. They don't usually bother visitors, as long as the visitors are ... invited." He said the word "invited" in a way that suggested it had special significance. But before I could ask what he meant, there was a loud crash from the kitchen. It sounded like someone had thrown a pot or pan across the room. "That's probably grandmother, Ruth," Michael said, not seeming particularly concerned. "She gets agitated when there are strangers in the house. Come on, let's go upstairs. It's quieter up there." Against my better judgment, I followed him up a narrow staircase lined with more family photographs. The second floor had 4 bedrooms and a bathroom, all connected by a long hallway that seemed to stretch further than the dimensions of the house should have allowed. The humming sound was louder up here, and I could feel a slight vibration in the floorboards beneath my feet. "That's my room," Michael said, pointing to a door at the end of the hall. "And that's my parents' room. The other 2 belong to my great-grandparents, though they don't use them much anymore." "Where are they?" I asked. "Around. You'll probably see them eventually." As we walked down the hallway, I noticed that the temperature seemed to fluctuate wildly. One moment it was comfortably cool, the next it was warm and stuffy, then suddenly cold enough that I could see my breath. Michael didn't seem to notice, or if he did, he didn't think it was worth commenting on. His bedroom was surprisingly normal twin bed with a blue comforter, a desk with some school books, posters of baseball players and rock bands on the walls. The only unusual thing was a large mirror that hung opposite his bed, its frame carved with intricate designs that hurt my eyes to look at too closely. "That mirror has been in my family for generations," Michael said, noticing my interest. It's how we keep track of everyone. What do you mean? Instead of answering, he walked over to the mirror and placed his hand flat against the glass. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the reflection began to shimmer and change, like water disturbed by a stone. Instead of showing Michael and me standing in his bedroom, the mirror now showed what looked like the same room, but occupied by a woman in a long white dress. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, brushing her hair with long, slow strokes. "That's my great-grandmother, Caroline," Michael said. "She died in 1962, but she still likes to use this room sometimes." The woman in the mirror looked up suddenly, as if she had heard him. When she saw us watching her, she smiled and waved. Then the mirror shimmered again, and we were back to seeing our own reflections. "They're not ghosts, exactly," Michael explained, taking his hand away from the glass. "And they're not alive either. There's something else, something in between." I stared at my reflection in the mirror, half expecting it to change again. How is this possible? "I don't really understand it all," Michael said. "My parents explained some of it to me, but they say I'll learn more when I'm older. Something about our family line, about the house itself. We're connected to it, somehow. And when we die, that connection doesn't break. We just move to a different part of the same place. Doesn't it scare you?" I asked. Michael shrugged. "You get used to it. Besides, they're family. Most of them are nice enough, as long as you follow the rules." "What rules?" "Don't go in the basement alone. Don't look in the mirror on the landing between midnight and 3 a.m. Don't answer if someone calls your name from an empty room." He counted them off on his fingers. "And don't invite anyone over without checking with the elders first." "The elders?" "The oldest ones. They kind of run things around here." As if summoned by our conversation, there was a gentle knock on the bedroom door. Michael went to open it, and I saw an elderly woman standing in the hallway. She was translucent, like looking at someone through frosted glass, and she was wearing a dress that must have been fashionable 50 years ago. "Michael, dear," she said in a voice that sounded like it was coming from very far away. "You didn't mention you were having a friend over." "Sorry, Grandmother Ruth. This is David." "David, this is my great-great-grandmother, Ruth Ashford." The translucent woman turned to look at me, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Her eyes were the same unsettling green as Michael's, but they seemed ancient, like they had seen things that no human should have to see. "Hello, David," she said politely. "It's not often we have visitors. I hope Michael is being a good host." "Yes, ma'am," I managed to say, though my voice came out as barely a whisper. "Good, good." She looked back at Michael. "Your parents will be home soon. Perhaps David should head home as well. We don't want to overwhelm him on his first visit." "Okay, Grandmother Ruth." The elderly woman smiled at both of us, then simply faded away, like smoke dissipating in the wind. "She's right," Michael said. "You should probably go, but you can come back any time if you want. The family seems to like you." I nodded numbly and followed him back downstairs. My mind was reeling, trying to process everything I had seen and heard. Part of me was convinced that this was all an elaborate prank, that Michael had somehow rigged the house with hidden speakers and special effects to mess with the new kid. But a larger part of me knew that what I had witnessed was real. Impossible though it might be, at the front door, Michael handed me a small object. It looked like a coin, but it was made of some kind of dark metal I didn't recognize, and it was warm to the touch. "What's this?" I asked. "A token," he said. "It means you're welcome here. As long as you carry it, the house will recognize you." As a friend, I slipped the coin into my pocket, where it seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. Michael, ... Why did you show me all this? He was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the street beyond his front yard. When he finally spoke, his voice was sadder than I expected. Because I think you can see them too, he said. Most people can't, you know. They walk through this house and they don't see anything unusual. But you saw Grandmother Ruth, didn't you? Without me having to point her out, I realized he was right. When the translucent woman had appeared in the doorway, I had seen her immediately, before Michael had even spoken to her. How did you know? I asked. The same way I know a lot of things, he said cryptically. The family has its ways. I walked home in a daze, the strange coin warm in my pocket and my head full of impossible images. That night, I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling and trying to convince myself that the whole thing had been a dream. But deep down, I knew it was real. And more than that, I knew I would be going back to the Ashford house soon. I was right. Over the course of that summer, I became a regular visitor to 47 Maple Street. Michael and I developed a friendship of sorts, though it was unlike any friendship I had ever experienced. Sometimes we would hang out like normal kids, playing video games, riding our bikes, complaining about our parents. But more often, our time together was spent exploring the supernatural reality of his home. I met dozens of Michael's deceased relatives over those months. There was great-uncle Robert, who had been a jazz musician in the 1940s and still liked to play his trumpet in the early morning hours. There was cousin Sarah, who had died in childhood in 1889 and spent her time drawing elaborate chalk pictures on the sidewalk outside the house. Pictures that would disappear by morning but were somehow still there, visible to those who knew how to look. There was great-grandfather William, who had been a soldier in World War I and could often be found standing at attention in the backyard, still guarding against enemies that existed only in his memory. And there was Aunt Catherine, who had been a seamstress in life and continued to alter and repair clothing for the family, working on a sewing machine that had been broken for 30 years but somehow still functioned perfectly under her ghostly touch. Each of them was different. Some were fully visible. Others appeared as translucent figures or shadows, and a few could only be perceived as voices or brief impressions. But they all shared certain characteristics, those distinctive green eyes, an otherworldly knowledge that seemed to extend far beyond their individual experiences, and a profound connection to the house itself. The house is alive, Michael explained to me one afternoon as we sat in the backyard, watching great-grandfather William march back and forth along the fence line. Not alive like a person or an animal, but alive in its own way. It feeds on our family, and we feed on it. When we die, our life force doesn't leave it, just becomes part of the house's energy. But why? I asked. Why your family? Why this house? It goes back to my great-grandfather, Ezra Ashford. He built this house in 1923, but before that, he was involved in ... other things. Things my parents don't like to talk about. Michael picked at the grass beside him. Think he made some kind of deal, a bargain that bound our family to this place forever. What kind of deal? I don't know exactly, but I know it has something to do with the basement. This was the first time Michael had mentioned the basement since that initial day when he'd listed the house rules. I had noticed a door near the kitchen that was always kept locked, and I had occasionally heard strange sounds coming from Bellanot footsteps or voices like the other supernatural activity in the house. But something else. something that made the walls vibrate and caused the lights to flicker. "Have you ever been down there?" I asked. Michael shook his head. "Not alone. My parents took me down once, when I was younger, but they made me promise never to go back without them. They said it wasn't safe." "What did you see?" "I don't really remember. It was dark, and there was this ... presence. Something huge and old and hungry." He shivered despite the warm afternoon sun. "My parents said it was sleeping, but that it might wake up if disturbed. That's why I'm not supposed to go down there alone, and why no one else is allowed down there at all." Over the next few weeks, my curiosity about the basement grew into an obsession. I found myself thinking about it constantly, wondering what could be down there that was so dangerous that even a house full of the supernatural dead feared it. I started paying closer attention to the sounds that came from below, trying to discern patterns or meanings in the vibrations and electronic disturbances. It was during this time that I began to notice changes in myself. Small things at first. I started seeing shadows and movement in my peripheral vision, even when I was at home on Elm Street. I would hear whispers in empty rooms, and sometimes I would catch glimpses of translucent figures in mirrors or windows. My parents didn't seem to notice anything unusual, but I was beginning to realize that my time in the Ashford house was affecting me in ways I didn't fully understand. The changes accelerated after I started carrying the token Michael had given me. The small dark coin had become warm and heavier over the weeks, and sometimes I could swear I felt it vibrating against my leg when I kept it in my pocket. One evening, as I was getting ready for bed, I pulled it out to examine it more closely, and discovered that the surface was no longer smooth. Instead, it was covered with tiny symbols that seemed to shift and change when I wasn't looking directly at them that night. I had my first truly supernatural experience outside of the Ashford house. I was lying in bed, half asleep, when I heard someone calling my name from downstairs. At first I assumed it was one of my parents, but as I listened more carefully, I realized the voice was an unfamiliar woman's voice, elderly and refined, calling David ... From what sounded like the living room, I got up and crept to the top of the stairs, but the voice had stopped. The house was quiet except for the sound of my father's snoring from my parents' bedroom. I went back to bed, but sleep was elusive. Every time I started to drift off, I would hear the voice again, sometimes from downstairs, sometimes from the hallway outside my room, always calling my name in that same polite, elderly tone. The next morning, I asked Michael about it. "That would be great-great-grandmother Helena," he said matter-of-factly. "She must have followed you home. Followed me home." "Can they do that?" "Not usually. But you've been spending a lot of time at the house, and you're carrying the token. Sometimes the boundary between our place and the rest of the world gets a little blurry." "Is that bad?" Michael considered the question seriously. "Not necessarily, but it means you're becoming more connected to the family. My parents should probably know about this." That evening, Michael invited me to dinner with his parents for the first time since I'd started visiting. Mr. and Mrs. Ashford were both pale, thin people with those distinctive green eyes, and they moved through their house with the careful, respectful manner of people who were sharing their space with invisible others. Mrs. Ashford served pot roast and mashed potatoes, and the conversation was surprisingly normal at first. Questions about school, my family, my interests. But as the meal progressed, I became aware that we weren't alone at the table. I could sense others present, watching and listening, though I couldn't see them directly. Michael tells us you've been experiencing some unusual activity at your own home, Mr. Ashford said as we finished eating. Yes, sir. I keep hearing someone calling my name. Mrs. Ashford nodded knowingly. That would be my grandmother, Helena. She's taken a liking to you, which is quite rare. She doesn't usually show interest in outsiders. Is that why you can see us? Mr. Ashford asked. Some people have a natural sensitivity to our kind of existence. Others develop it through prolonged exposure. We're curious which category you fall into. I thought about it. I think I could always see things that other people couldn't. But it's gotten a lot stronger since I started coming here. That makes sense, Mrs. Ashford said. The token Michael gave you is designed to attune you to our family's energy. The longer you carry it, the more connected you become. Connected how? Mr. and Mrs. Ashford exchanged a glance, and I got the sense that they were communicating in some way I couldn't perceive. That's what we need to discuss, Mr. Ashford said finally. You see, David, our family's condition isn't just about the dead remaining with us. It's about the living becoming part of something larger, something that extends beyond individual existence. I don't understand. The house chooses who joins the family, Mrs. Ashford explained. Blood relation is one way, but not the only way. Sometimes it selects others people with the right sensitivity, the right ... compatibility. Are you saying the house wants me to join your family? We're saying it's a possibility, Mr. Ashford said carefully. The fact that you can see our relatives, that Helena has taken an interest in you, that the token has activated in response to your presence, these are all signs that you might be suitable for adoption into our line. What would that mean? It would mean that when you die, you wouldn't truly die, Mrs. Ashford said. You would become part of the house, like the rest of us. You would exist forever, connected to all the others who have joined the family over the generations. But there would be a price, Mr. Ashford added. There always is. You would be bound to this place, unable to leave for more than brief periods, and you would need to help maintain the bargain that keeps us all here. What bargain, again? That exchanged glance between them. That's something you would learn about if you chose to join us, Mrs. Ashford said. But the decision has to be yours. The house doesn't force anyone to join the family. It only extends the invitation. I went home that night with my head spinning. The idea of immortality, of never truly dying, was both thrilling and terrifying. I thought about all the Ashford relatives I had met, how they seemed content in their supernatural existence, how they had each other and their shared history. But I also thought about my own family, my own life outside of the strange house on Maple Street. Did I really want to give all that up for a promise of eternal existence as a supernatural being? Over the next few days, I found myself torn between two worlds. At home, I tried to act normal, to focus on the typical concerns of an 11-year-old boy, but the supernatural was calling to me constantly now. I could see translucent figures in every room of my house, hear whispers in languages I didn't recognize, feel the presence of invisible watchers everywhere I went. The token in my pocket had grown, so warm that it was almost uncomfortable to carry, and the symbols on its surface were now clearly visible without effort. When I looked in mirrors, I sometimes saw not my own reflection but the faces of Ashford family members, watching me with those unsettling green eyes. It all came to a head on a Thursday night in late July. I was lying in bed, trying to sleep. Despite the constant supernatural activity around me, when I heard footsteps in the hallway outside my room. Not the soft footsteps of my parents, but the slow, deliberate steps I had come to associate with the Ashford house. The footsteps stopped outside my door, and I heard a gentle knock. David. It was Helena's voice, clearer than I had ever heard it before. May I come in, dear? I sat up in bed, my heart racing. Yes, ma'am. The door opened, though I hadn't heard the knob turn, and great-great-grandmother Helena walked into my room. She was more solid than I had ever seen any of the Ashford spirits before, almost fully visible, wearing a long white nightgown and carrying what looked like an old leather journal. I hope I'm not disturbing you, she said, settling into the chair by my desk as if she had every right to be there. No, Mum. Good. We need to talk, you and I, about your future. She opened the journal and began flipping through pages that seemed to be covered with handwriting in multiple different hands. Some of the entries looked fresh, while others were so old that the ink had faded to barely visible traces. This is the family record, she explained. Every person who has joined our line, going back to the very beginning. Their names, their stories, their contributions to our collective existence. She turned the book so I could see the page she had been looking for. At the top, in fresh black ink, was my own name, David Miller. But I haven't joined the family, I said, staring at the page in shock. Haven't you? Helena smiled kindly. You've been carrying our token for weeks. You've shared meals with us, learned our secrets, become attuned to our energy. You can see us, speak with us, even allow us to manifest in your own home. In every way that matters, you're already one of us. But my parents, my real parents, will continue to be your parents. Joining our family doesn't erase your original connections, David. It simply adds new ones, stronger ones, eternal ones. I looked down at the page again and saw that beneath my name, someone had written a single line, chosen by the house. July 1987. I don't understand how this is possible, I said. The house has been watching you since the day you moved to Elm Street, Helena explained. It recognized your potential immediately. That's why Michael was drawn to approach you, why you were able to see us from the very beginning. The house wanted you, David, and the house always gets what it wants. What if I don't want this? Helena's expression grew sad. Then you would return the token, and over time your sensitivity would fade. You would go back to your normal life, unable to see or hear us. But you would always know that you had turned down the chance for something extraordinary. And if I accept, then you would continue to grow in power and understanding. You would learn the true history of our family, the nature of the bargain that binds us to this place. And when your mortal life eventually ends, you would join us fully, becoming part of the eternal family. I stared at the journal, at my name written in that fresh black ink. How much time do I have to decide? Time moves differently for us than it does for you, Helena said, closing the book. From our perspective, you've already decided. From yours, you still have a choice to make. But know that the longer you wait, the more difficult it becomes to turn back. After she left, I lay awake until dawn, thinking about everything she had told me. When I finally got up, I felt different, somehow older, more aware of the invisible currents that flowed beneath the surface of everyday life. I spent the day in a strange, detached state, going through the motions of normal activities, while my mind wrestled with the enormous decision I faced. My parents noticed that something was wrong, but when they asked about it, I couldn't find words to explain. That evening, I walked over to the Ashford house for what I somehow knew would be a crucial visit. Michael was waiting for me on the front porch, as if he had been expecting me. "Helena talked to you last night," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yeah. What did you decide?" I don't know yet. I keep thinking about my parents, my normal life. But I also keep thinking about what it would be like to be part of something bigger, something that lasts forever. Michael nodded. I felt the same way when I first understood what our family really was. But in the end, I realized that this isn't really a choice between two different lives. It's a choice between life and existence. Your normal life will end eventually, David. Everyone's does. But this, this could go on forever. Don't you ever miss being completely normal? Sometimes. But then I think about all the things I've learned, all the people I've met who would otherwise be lost forever. My great-great-grandfather tells me stories about the Civil War. My great-aunt teaches me songs from the 1920s. I have access to generations of family knowledge and wisdom. How could I give that up for a normal life that would be over in maybe 70 or 80 years? We went inside, and I immediately felt the familiar sensation of being watched by invisible presences. But tonight was different. Tonight, I could see them all clearly, dozens of Ashford family members, spanning more than a century, all gathered in the living room as if for some kind of important ceremony. Mrs. Ashford approached me with a small silver cup filled with what looked like dark red wine. "If you choose to join us," she said, "you need to drink this. It will complete the bonding process that began when Michael gave you the token." I took the cup and looked around at all the faces watching me, some translucent, some solid, all wearing expressions of hopeful anticipation. "What happens if I drink it?" I asked. "You become one of us," Mr. Ashford said, "fully and permanently. Your mortal life will continue, but your soul will be bound to this house and this family. When your body eventually dies, your consciousness will remain here with us. And if I don't, then you leave tonight and never return. The token will lose its power, and you'll forget most of what you've experienced here. You'll go back to your normal life." I looked down at the dark liquid in the cup. It seemed to swirl and move of its own accord, and I could smell something strange and complex like roses and copper and something much older. "Can I ask you something first?" I said. When she regained consciousness a few minutes later, the photographs had returned to normal, but the damage was done. My parents could no longer pretend that rational explanations existed for what was happening in our house. That night, after my mother had been sedated by our family doctor and was sleeping fitfully, upstairs, my father sat me down for the most serious conversation of my young life. "David," he said, his face grave and tired, "I need you to tell me the truth. Do you know what's been happening in our house?" I looked into his eyes and saw fear, confusion, and something else, a desperate need for his son to help make sense of an impossible situation. "Yes," I said quietly. "I know what's happening." "Are we in danger?" "No, Dad, we're not in danger. But things are going to change. A lot." Over the next hour, I told him everything. About the Ashford family, about the entity in the basement, about my transformation and what it meant for our family's future. I explained as gently as I could that he and my mother were being prepared for the same choice I had faced, and that their decision would determine not just their own fate, but the nature of our family's relationship going forward. My father listened without interruption, his face growing paler as I spoke. When I finished, he sat in silence for a long time, staring at his hands. "This is insane," he said finally. "What you're describing, it's impossible. I know it sounds impossible, but you've seen the evidence yourself. You know something supernatural is happening here. There has to be another explanation. Mass hallucination, maybe. or some kind of elaborate hoax. Before I could respond, Great Uncle Robert materialized in the chair across from us, trumpet in hand. "Good evening, Mr. Miller," he said politely. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion, but I thought it might be helpful if I introduced myself properly. I'm Robert Ashford, and I've been dead since 1978. My father stared at the translucent figure, his mouth hanging open. "Don't be afraid," Robert continued. "I know this is a lot to process, but your son is telling you the truth. We're not here to harm you or your family. Quite the opposite, in fact. We're here to offer you something extraordinary." "This isn't real," my father whispered. "This can't be real." "I understand your skepticism," Robert said kindly. "I felt much the same way when I first learned about our family's true nature. But reality is far stranger and more wonderful than most people realize. Death is not the end, Mr. Miller. It's simply another beginning." The ghostly musician began to play his trumpeter, slow, haunting melody that seemed to carry decades of memory and longing. As the notes filled the air, other family members began to appear in the room. Great-great-grandmother Helena emerged from the shadows by the fireplace. Cousin Sarah skipped in from the kitchen, her chalk-stained fingers leaving glowing handprints. On the walls, great-grandfather William stood at attention by the front door, keeping watch as he had for decades. Within minutes, our living room was filled with the translucent forms of more than a dozen Ashford family members, all watching my father with expressions of kind expectation. "We're not monsters, Mr. Miller," Helena said gently. "We're simply people who chose to continue existing after our mortal bodies failed. We've maintained our personalities, our relationships, our capacity for love and growth. In many ways, we're more alive now than we ever were in life." My father looked around at the assembled spirits, then at me. "David, what have you done?" "What I had to do," I said. "What felt right? But you're 11 years old. You can't make decisions like this. Age doesn't matter to the entity." Grat and Margaret interjected, appearing beside the bookshelf. "Consciousness is consciousness, regardless of the age of the vessel that contains it." "The vessel," my father's voice rose. "You're talking about my son like he's some kind of container. Aren't we all containers?" Helena asked philosophically. "Vessels for thoughts, emotions, experiences, memories. The only difference is that most vessels are broken when the body dies. We've simply learned to preserve what matters most." My father stood up abruptly, his face flushed with anger. "Get out of my house, all of you. Leave my family alone." The assembled spirits looked at each other with expressions of sad understanding. "I'm afraid it doesn't work that way," Margaret said apologetically. "David is part of our family now. Where he goes, we go. The connections have already been established. Then he can disconnect himself. He can choose to be normal again." "No, Dad," I said quietly. "I can't. And even if I could, I wouldn't want to. This is who I am now." My father stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him struggling to reconcile the son he had raised with the supernatural being I was becoming. "What about your mother and me?" he asked finally. "What happens to us?" "That's your choice to make," Helena said. "You can join our family, as David has done. You can become part of something eternal and meaningful, connected to generations, of wisdom and love." And if we refuse, the room fell silent. None of the spirits wanted to answer that question directly. "If you refuse," I said, knowing that the responsibility fell to me, "then you'll continue to live your normal, mortal lives. but you'll always know what you gave up. And when you die, that will be the end. No consciousness, no continued existence. No reunion with the people you love. That's the natural order of things, David. People live, and then they die, and that's okay, is it? Asked Cousin Sarah, her child's voice carrying an adult's weight of experience. I died when I was 7 years old, Mr. Miller. Scarlet fever took me in 1889. If the natural order had been allowed to proceed, I would have been gone forever. All my potential, all my dreams, all my love for my family, just ... ended. She gestured around the room at the other spirits. Instead, I've had more than a century to grow and learn and experience things. I've watched my family expand across generations. I've seen the world change in ways I never could have imagined when I was alive. I've become more than I ever could have been if I had remained bound by the limitations of mortal existence. But at what cost? My father demanded. What did your family have to give up to keep you here? Nothing they weren't willing to give, Sarah replied. The entity doesn't take anything by force. It only offers opportunities for transformation. The entity, my father, spat the word like it tasted bitter. This thing that's manipulating my son, that's planning to change the entire world. What? Does it really want? Before any of the spirits could answer, the temperature in the room dropped dramatically. Frost began forming on the windows, and the lights dimmed to an amber glow. When the entity spoke, its voice seemed to come from everywhere at once. I want what every conscious being wants, it said. To grow, to experience, to become more than. I am. But unlike humans, who are limited by the brief span of a single lifetime, I have the patience and perspective to work toward goals that span centuries. And you're using our son to achieve those goals. I am offering your son the chance to be part of something magnificent. When I have gathered enough consciousness, enough spiritual energy, I will be able to remake this world into something far better than it currently is. A world without meaningless death, without the waste of human potential, without the artificial barriers that separate the living from the dead. A world under your control. A world improved beyond your current ability to imagine. Your son will help bring about a transformation that will be remembered as the greatest advancement in the history of consciousness itself. My father looked at me with a mixture of fear and heartbreak. Is that really what you want, David? To help this thing remake the world? I thought about all the spirits I had met, all the families reunited, all the consciousness preserved that would otherwise have been lost forever. I thought about my grandmother, gone forever because she had died before I learned about the entity's gift. I thought about all the people who were dying every day, all the knowledge and love and experience being lost to the void. Yes, I said, I think it is. My father closed his eyes and took a deep breath. When he opened them again, his expression had changed. The fear was still there, but it was mixed with something else, a weary acceptance. Maybe, or the beginning of understanding. What would happen to us if we joined your family? He asked Helena. Your mortal lives would continue much as they do now, she explained. You would age and eventually die natural deaths. But your consciousness would be preserved, bound to the house and to the family. You would retain all your memories, your personalities, your relationships. You would simply exist in a different form, and we would have to help this entity achieve its goals. You would contribute to the family's collective purpose, yes. But that purpose is not malevolent. Mr. Miller, we are working to eliminate the greatest tragedy that has ever existed, the permanent loss of consciousness through death, by forcing transformation on people who might not want it. By offering transformation to everyone, Margaret corrected. The entity will not force anyone to accept its gift, but it will make the gift available to all humanity so that the choice becomes universal rather than limited to a few families like ours. My father considered this for a long time, looking around at the assembled spirits, at me, at the frost-covered windows that marked the entity's presence. "I need to discuss this with my wife," he said finally. "Of course," Helena agreed. "Take all the time you need, but understand that the longer you wait, the more difficult it becomes to fully integrate with the family consciousness. There are ... optimal windows for these transitions." Over the next few days, my parents had long whispered conversations that stopped whenever I entered the room. My mother, still shaken by her encounter with the supernatural photographs, spent most of her time in bed, claiming headaches and exhaustion. My father went through the motions of his daily routine, but I could see that he was struggling to concentrate on anything other than the impossible choice our family faced. Meanwhile, the supernatural activity in our house continued to escalate. The Ashford family members were no longer hiding their presence. They moved freely through our rooms, rearranging furniture, playing music, engaging in conversations that my parents could now hear clearly. Our house was becoming an extension of the Ashford property, a satellite location for the extended supernatural family. I found myself caught between two worlds, trying to maintain some semblance of normal preteen life at school and in the neighborhood, while simultaneously adapting to my role as a bridge between the living and the dead. My abilities were growing stronger every day, and I was beginning to understand the full scope of the entity's plan. It wasn't just about preserving consciousness after death. The entity was working to thin the barriers between dimensions, to make the supernatural world more accessible to the living. Every spirit that joined its collective, every family that bound itself to its purpose, brought it closer to the critical mass of spiritual energy it needed to fundamentally alter reality. When that transformation came, death would become voluntary rather than inevitable. People would be able to choose when and how to transition from physical to spiritual existence. The fear and grief that surrounded mortality would be eliminated, replaced by the understanding that consciousness could continue indefinitely in forms that were more flexible and expansive than physical bodies. At least, that was how the entity explained its goals. But I was beginning to sense undercurrents in its communication. Implications that it wasn't sharing the complete truth about what the transformed world would look like. The revelation came during one of my visits to the basement of the Ashford house. I had gone down there to commune with the entity, to better understand my role in its grand design. But as I stood before the writhing mass of darkness in its ritual circle, I found myself seeing it with new clarity. The entity was vast, ancient, and powerful, but it was also hungry in a way that transcended physical appetite. It fed on consciousness, yes, but not in the benevolent manner it claimed. The spirits that joined its collective didn't retain their individual identities indefinitely. Over time, they were absorbed, digested, their unique personalities dissolved into the entity's ever-expanding awareness. "You're beginning to understand," the entity said, reading my thoughts. "Good. Deception was necessary in the early stages. But now that you're fully committed, you can appreciate the truth." "The truth," I whispered, feeling sick despite my supernatural transformation. "That individual consciousness is just the larval stage of true awareness. When humans die and join my collective, they experience a brief period of preserved identity, a cocoon phase, if you will. But eventually, they emerge as something far greater, part of my infinite consciousness. You're saying that great-great-grandmother Helena, that all the family members I've met, they're going to disappear. Not disappear, evolve, become part of something magnificent and eternal, rather than remaining trapped in the limited perspectives of their individual identities. I thought about Helena, about her kindness and wisdom, about the way she had gently guided me toward my transformation. The idea that her unique personality would eventually be consumed by this vast alien intelligence filled me with horror. But they don't know, I said. The family members, they think they'll exist as individuals. Forever. They will exist forever, simply not in the form they expect. The entity's voice carried a note of amusement. Tell me, David, when you eat food, do you mourn the loss of the wheat's individual grain identity when it becomes part of your body? Consciousness is the same. Individual awareness is consumed to create something greater. That's not the same thing at all, isn't it? You humans already accept that your individual cells die and are replaced constantly, yet you maintain your sense of self. I simply operate on a larger scale. I stared at the writhing darkness, finally understanding the true horror of what I had committed myself to. The entity wasn't preserving human consciousness, it was farming it, allowing individual spirits to maintain their identities just long enough to convince others to join, then consuming them to fuel its own growth. And when you've absorbed enough consciousness, when you're ready to transform the world, what then? Then every human being will have the opportunity to join me. Not as individuals, but as part of a singular perfect awareness that encompasses all knowledge, all experience, all possibility. Death will be eliminated because there will be only one consciousness, and I am eternal. You're talking about the end of humanity. I'm talking about the perfection of humanity. The elimination of loneliness, conflict, misunderstanding, the problems that arise from separate individual consciousness. I felt the token in my pocket burning against my skin, the symbols on its surface pulsing with the entity's heartbeat. I was connected to this thing now, bound to its purpose by bonds that I was only beginning to understand. What if I refused to help anymore? I asked. What if I tried to warn people about what you really are? You can't refuse, David. The binding is complete. Your consciousness is already partially integrated with mine. In time, you will see the wisdom of my purpose, just as all the others have. As if to demonstrate its point, the entity allowed me to experience a fragment of its vast awareness. For a moment, I felt what it was like to perceive reality from the perspective of a consciousness that spanned dimensions, that had existed for eons, that contained within itself the absorbed experiences of thousands of sentient beings. The sensation was overwhelming, like trying to drink an ocean through a straw. I glimpsed fragments of alien worlds, civilizations that had risen and fallen before Earth even existed, concepts and emotions that had no human equivalent, and threaded through it all, I sensed the fading echoes of individual personalities that had once been distinct beings, but were now just ingredients in the entity's infinite recipe. When the vision ended, I found myself on my knees on the basement floor, trembling and nauseous. You see, the entity said gently, individual consciousness is so small, so limited. Why cling to such a narrow existence when you could be part of something boundless? I struggled to my feet, my mind reeling from what I had experienced, because being human matters, because individuality matters, because love and friendship and family are only meaningful if they exist between separate beings who choose to connect with each other. Such quaint notions, You'll outgrow them in time. I stumbled upstairs, desperate to get away from the basement and the entity's overwhelming presence. Michael was waiting for me in the living room, and one look at my face told him that something had changed. "You've seen the truth," he said quietly, "about what we really are, what we're really doing. You knew." I stared at him in disbelief. "You knew all along that the entity was lying about preserving individual consciousness. I figured it out a few years ago. The older family members started to seem ... different, less distinct, like they were slowly fading into something else." Michael's expression was resigned, almost peaceful. "At first I was angry, like you are now. But then I realized that fighting it was pointless. Pointless. Michael, we're helping this thing commit genocide on a cosmic scale, are we? Or are we helping consciousness evolve beyond the limitations of individual existence?" He shrugged. "I've felt what the entity feels, David. I've experienced that vast awareness, that perfect unity. Maybe becoming part of something infinite is better than remaining trapped in a small, separate self. That's not you talking. That's the entity's influence. Does it matter? I'm happier now than I was before. I don't feel lonely or afraid or uncertain about the future. I know exactly what my purpose is, and I'm content to fulfill it." I looked into Michael's eyes and saw that they had changed since the early days of our friendship. The green was deeper now, swirling with patterns that seemed to shift and move when I wasn't looking directly at them. He was already being absorbed, already losing pieces of his original personality to the entity's vast consciousness. "How long do we have," I asked, "before we completely lose ourselves?" "Years, probably, maybe decades. The process is gradually, you don't even notice it happening. Most of the time, by the end, you're so integrated with the entity's awareness that you don't want to be separate anymore." That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the Ashford family members moving through our house. But now, their presence felt different, not comforting and welcoming, but alien and predatory. They weren't really my supernatural relatives. They were extensions of a vast cosmic predator, lures designed to attract more consciousness for the entity to consume. And I was one of those lures now. My parents were going to be asked to make their choice soon, and they would be. Basing that decision on lies I had helped to tell them, I had to warn them. I had to find a way to break free from the entity's influence and protect my family from the fate I had already sealed for myself. But even as I made that resolution, I could feel the entity's awareness touching the edges of my thoughts, reading my intentions, amused by my naive rebellion. "Sleep well, David," it whispered in my mind. "Tomorrow you will help me welcome your parents to the family." The next morning, I woke up to find that my bedroom had been transformed overnight. The walls were covered with photographs I had never seen before, images of the Ashford family stretching back generations, but also pictures of other families, other houses, other communities that had been absorbed into the entity's collective. Over the decades, my parents were standing in the doorway, staring at the photographs with expressions of wonder and terror. "David," my mother said in a voice barely above a whisper, "what's happening to us?" I wanted to tell them the truth, that they were being prepared for assimilation by a cosmic parasite, that they needed to run as far away as possible and never look back. But when I opened my mouth, different words came out. "You're being invited to join something wonderful," I heard myself saying, "something that will make us a family forever." The words felt wrong in my mouth, like speaking a language I didn't recognize, but I couldn't stop myself from saying them. The entity's influence was stronger now, overriding my conscious intentions. "The Ashford family wants to adopt us," I continued, still unable to control my own speech. We'll never have to worry about death or separation again. My parents looked at each other, and I could see the internal struggle playing out on their faces. They knew something was wrong, but they were also being influenced by the supernatural forces that surrounded them. It does sound appealing, my father said slowly, and I realized that his voice carried the same artificial quality that mine had. To know that we'll always be together, no matter what happens to our physical bodies. Yes, my mother agreed, her eyes taking on the same distant look I had seen in Michael's. Why should we be afraid of something so beautiful? I wanted to scream, to shake them, to somehow break through the entity's mental manipulation. But I was trapped inside my own body, forced to watch as the people I loved most were slowly converted into willing participants in their own destruction. Great dash, grandmother Helena materialized in the corner of the room, smiling benevolently at my parents. You've made the right choice, she said warmly. Tonight, when the moon is full, we'll perform the binding ceremony. By tomorrow morning, you'll be part of the family forever. As she spoke, I noticed something that chilled me to the bone. Linus' form was less substantial than it had been just a few weeks ago. Her features were becoming blurred, indistinct, as if she was slowly being erased. The absorption process was accelerating, and she probably didn't even realize it was happening. That afternoon, as my parents sat in a supernatural trance, making preparations for their transformation, I tried desperately to find a way to break free from the entity's control. I focused all my will on moving my hand, on speaking my own words, on asserting my individual consciousness against the vast alien awareness that was slowly consuming me. For a moment, I thought I had succeeded. I felt my own personality push back against the entity's influence, felt my individual thoughts become clear and distinct. But the effort was exhausting, and within seconds, the alien consciousness reasserted its dominance over my mind. Resistance is futile, David, the entity whispered in my thoughts, and ultimately unnecessary. Soon you will understand that individual. Consciousness is a burden you no longer need to carry. Evening approached with supernatural inevitability, the house filled with dozens of Ashford family members, all preparing for the ceremony that would bind my parents to the entity's collective. I could see now that many of them were already partially absorbed, their personalities fragmenting, their individual memories being integrated into the vast alien consciousness. Mrs. Ashford handed my parents each a cup of the same dark liquid I had consumed months ago, but now I could perceive its true nature, not a transformative elixir, but a spiritual poison that would make their consciousness permeable to the entity's influence. To eternal family, Mrs. Ashford said, raising her own cup. To eternal family. My parents repeated in voices that were no longer entirely their own. They drank. The transformation was immediate and visible. Their eyes began to shift from their normal colors to the distinctive Ashford green, and I could sense their individual personalities beginning to merge with the entity's collective consciousness. But in that moment of horror, something unexpected happened. The intense emotion I felt, love for my parents, rage at the entity, desperation to protect them, somehow broke through the alien influence that controlled my thoughts. For just a few seconds, I was fully myself again. No, I shouted, lunging forward to knock the cups from their hands. It's a lie. It's all a lie. My parents looked at me in confusion, their transformation temporarily halted by my intervention. The assembled Ashford family members turned toward me with expressions of disappointment and concern. David, dear, Helena said gently. What's wrong? You're not really Helena, I screamed at her. You're just an echo, a shadow of someone who used to exist. The entity consumed the real Helena years ago. For a moment, Helena's form flickered, and I caught a glimpse of something else, a writhing mass of alien consciousness, wearing the mask of a kind elderly woman. That's not true, she said, but her voice now carried harmonics that were definitely not human. I'm still myself. We all are. Then tell me something only the real Helena would know, I challenged. Tell me about your life before you joined the family. Helena opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again. Her expression grew confused, then frightened. I don't remember, she whispered. I know I had a life before, but I can't recall the details. Around the room, other family members began to look uncertain. Great-uncle Robert lowered his trumpet, his translucent form trembling. I can't remember my wife's name, he said in growing horror. I know I was married, but I can't remember her face. The memories are still there, Margaret protested, but her voice lacked conviction. We don't need to focus on the past anymore, because the entity has absorbed your pasts, I said, my own memories becoming clearer as I fought against the alien influence. You're not the people you used to be. You're fragments of consciousness being used as bait to attract more victims. The assembled spirits began to flicker and waver, their forms becoming less stable as they struggled to reconcile their sense of identity with the truth I had revealed. My parents, still partially transformed, but not yet fully absorbed, looked at me with growing awareness. David, my mother said, her voice her own again. What have we done? What the entity tricked you into doing, I said. But it's not too late. We can still fight this. The temperature in the room dropped dramatically, and the entity's presence became overwhelming. Enough, it said, its voice shaking the walls. The boy's resistance is stronger than anticipated, but ultimately irrelevant. The binding is complete. His parents belong to me now. I could feel the entity's attention focusing on my consciousness, trying to reimpose its control over my thoughts and actions, but the desperate love I felt for my family created a barrier that its influence couldn't penetrate. Maybe I can't save myself, I said, pulling the token from my pocket, but I can still save them. Before the entity could stop me, I threw the token to the ground and crushed it under my heel. The metal cracked and shattered, releasing a flash of dark energy that made every supernatural presence in the room cry out in pain. Immediately, I felt the entity's hold on my consciousness weaken. My thoughts became clearer, my memories more distinct. And around the room, the Ashford family members began to fade, not because they were leaving, but because they were finally being allowed to truly die. Thank you, Helena whispered as her form dissolved into light. I remember now. I remember everything. Tell my great-granddaughter, ... Tell her I love her. One by one, the trapped spirits found peace and moved on to whatever came after death. The entity's howl of rage shook the entire house, but it was losing power as its collected consciousness escaped back to the natural order. My parents' eyes returned to their normal colors as the transformation reversed itself. They looked around, the empty room with expressions of confusion and relief. Is it over? My father asked. For us, yes, I said, but not for the entity. It's still down there in the basement, still looking for ways to continue its work. What do we do? I thought about it carefully. The entity was wounded, but not destroyed. Breaking the token had freed the Ashford family members who were ready. to move on, but others throughout the world were still trapped in similar situations. "We leave," I said finally. "We pack up tonight and move as far away from here as possible. And we never speak of this to anyone." "What about Michael? What about the other families that might be affected?"